I love the music. Thanks, Mark. And thank you all for the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you to share a little bit of what went into the book we just had published with the Harvard Business Review called Reinventing Jobs, as well as some of the work that we as a firm have been doing with the World Economic Forum on re-envisioning a world where skills become the currency of the labor market. And so we are a relatively small group here. I'd love to make this an interactive session, so please do ask questions and challenges and the like. This quote here is from basically the second page of the book, and it's something that my co-author and I, John and I realized as we were looking at the various organizations who had transformed themselves, as we were looking at some of these emerging technologies. The thing that jumped out at us was what had long been the source of competitive advantage. Think of our legacy of culture, leadership routines, business processes, customer relationships, mindset, was rapidly becoming the primary impediment to the transformation of the organization as a result of what we increasingly think of as being digital. And so how do we get beyond some of those things that used to be our primary source of competitive advantage to actually start to use them in a way that enables us to transform as organizations? Now, what's driving many of the changes are, a lot of things that we can certainly appreciate, if not on a personal level, then on a professional level as it relates to technology. But it's more than just the evolution of technology. The second key force that is driving some of these changes is what we think of as the democratization of work, and I'll touch on that in a second. But from a technology perspective, I think, who better than the folks in this room to speak to the pace of change, pace as it relates to development, pace as it relates to convergence of multiple technologies, and then certainly the pace of adoption. Probably the poster child for that pace of adoption are those devices you have sitting next to you. For the first time since Adam and Eve, we can all reach half the world's population in 2 clicks. Just think about that. And really, I think the poster child for much of what we're seeing with regard to this transformation is what is happening with IoT. And if you do buy the book, please do, and don't read anything else, there is an awesome case study that we were really privileged to share and tell, and it's the story of Haier. Haier is the Chinese company that bought GE's appliance business. It owns Sanyo in Japan. It's a big part of Sanyo. It owns appliance manufacturers around the world. And it is a fascinating story of an organization that started off effectively as a state-owned enterprise in China, transforming itself from a legacy second industrial revolution company to one that has been purpose-built or purpose-reinvented for the IR. And it is a great example of the shift from the legacy debate of are we centralized versus decentralized to acknowledging that every enterprise today is a distributed enterprise which is at the hub of a broader ecosystem for work. So it's a fabulous case study, again, that we were very privileged to tell, which illustrates the power of those two forces of technology and the democratization of work. I'm going to apologize for the history lesson. I know we've just had lunch. Usually like to do this after drinks because it goes down a little better. But I think it's a useful starting point to just ground us in how work has evolved. This was a piece of analysis that we did for the World Economic Forum about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, because at that point, Klaus Schwab, the founder, released his book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution. And we asked ourselves the question of, has work fundamentally changed? Or is this just about technology increasing the pace with which business operates? And the thing that we realized very quickly was work has, in fact, changed. So if we take a step back, about 120 years, if you think of the second industrial revolution, the way many of us in the large established corporate enterprises that are represented in the room typically work was organized from disparate activities into jobs into job families. Those jobs were connected together into processes. Those jobs became the basis for income during and post-employment, and the notion of the job as a career was effectively sort of created. In that era, work was being done, the capabilities were being built, at very high marginal cost. So think of the cost of General Motors building another car, the cost of GE producing another appliance. Very high marginal cost, but the advantage was we built those capabilities in an era of great certainty. If you go back and look at how GE and General Motors and Ford operated, they could predict to probably the third decimal point what revenue growth would be next year. Today, we can't even predict what it's going to look like next month, right? You fast forward to the third industrial revolution, and what you start to see is the democratization of information. So for the first time, organizations could look outside their walls and understand what the cost of work would be, the capabilities associated with work being done elsewhere, the risks and the quality implications. And one of the first organizations that actually figured this out was Nike, which separated design and marketing from supply and manufacturing. And we started to see the company go from being this place where we all came together to do work to actually becoming more of this nexus for contracts. And this was the start of what we now know to be outsourcing. The average gains that we saw from outsourcing were about 25 to 30%. You fast forward to the fourth industrial revolution, and Uberization has become a word that we use to talk about the rapid democratization of work and the opportunity that arises from the proliferation of those technologies that you saw on the previous slide. So the growth of mobile, the rapid growth of cloud-based computing, the proliferation of low-cost sensors, and AI both acting as an accelerant as well as leveraging off of those technologies, and the opportunity for us to deconstruct work, distribute it anywhere in the world, and reaggregate and reconstruct jobs much faster, quicker, cheaper than ever before. Some of the gains that we have shown our clients as a result of this transformation of work is not the 25 to 30% that comes from outsourcing, where we shifted entire processes, but rather 60 to 80%. So a true game changer, and in a sense, we kind of answered our own question of, is this fundamentally different for work? And yes, it is. And hence the title of the book, Reinventing Jobs. And we'll spend a couple of minutes on why that notion of the job really does need to be rethought and reinvented. Now, at the heart of this change is what we think of as the new plurality of means for work. So if we started in the second industrial revolution, you had the binary choice of work either being done by an employee you developed or work being done by an employee you hired. In the third industrial revolution, we introduced outsourcing in all its shapes and guises. In the fourth, arguably, we have up to 8 different means for getting work done. We have the rapid rise of independent contractors or free agents. We have alliances, the relationships between large established organizations and many of the startups in this room. We have talent platforms. Later today, we're going to be spending some time with Upwork. And Upwork is, to me, probably the best example of the power of these marketplaces to transform work. You have volunteers. If you're in consumer goods or if you're in pharmaceuticals and technology, many make aggressive use of volunteers to help power their innovation or power their social media presence. And then obviously you've got the more recent entrance of robotics and AI. So one of the emerging core disciplines for organizations of every size and scale is how do we develop leaders as well as functions and operations functions to be able to orchestrate all of these different means for work, to be able to understand the speed to capability, productivity, costs, and risks associated with traversing and combining all of these different options for work. The framework that we developed, and this is from our second book, which we published in 2015, it was called Lead the Work, Navigating a World Beyond Employment, were essentially 3 continuums of choice. The first is, what is the work or the assignment? The second is, what does that mean for the organization? And the third is, what does that mean for the rewards associated with that ecosystem of talent that powers the business? On the far left is where we've arguably been for 130 years. Work done in jobs, those jobs collected at a point in space and time, and employment is the dominant relationship. The resulting organization is pretty self-contained. We've got that traditional pyramid, very protective of intellectual property, fairly insular and rigid in its construct. And the rewards look arguably very similar to what they did when Henry Ford created the assembly line. Everyone has a salary, some type of performance-based pay, some type of healthcare and pension benefits, so very permanent, collective and consistent, and certainly very traditional. On the far right is the new world of work, if you will, where work is broken up into tasks. Those tasks are dispersed over space and time, and you now have a set of virtual or market relationships. So the relationship you might have with Upwork, the relationship with your RPA vendor or your AI vendor. The resulting organization is much more permeable. Work and talent flow seamlessly in and out, more collaborative and interlinked, and the rewards look very different. What you pay Jim for that gig he has picked up for you on Upwork looks completely different from what you would pay him if you hired that person into your organization. It is completely individualized. It's a function of his marketplace, his worth in the marketplace. Versus if you hired this person into your organization, the first thing you would do would be to say, well, what grade level does he go into? What job family does he sit in? What are then all of the rewards that are indexed to this notion of a person in a position versus the world that is on the right? And I think one of the most significant challenges that we as business leaders are facing, certainly in the large established organizations, is how do we traverse all of the options and these continuums? What stays firmly on the left, and there is going to be a lot of work that stays firmly on the left, versus what starts moving to the right? We did a piece of research earlier this year, and we went out and talked to some 900 organizations to ask them how, against this backdrop of work leaving the organizational boundary, how automation would start to affect the way work was being done. And one of the questions we asked business leaders was, as you apply automation, are you increasing skill premiums or are you reducing them? And the answer was yes. And it sounds a little bit trivial and trite, but it actually painted perfectly this picture of how nuanced the application of automation can be. Let me give you two examples to illustrate those two responses. When we think of work being redesigned to lower skill premiums, one of the best examples for that, it's fairly unfortunate, but in the Midwest, I'm based in Chicago, we have lots and lots of small and medium enterprises focused on manufacturing. One of the very negative effects of the opioid crisis in this country has been its effect on labor participation in the Midwest specifically. By some estimates, labor participation is down about 20% over the course of the last 5 years. Not a statistic that gets talked about very often. But what we are seeing is automation playing a fairly interesting role there. So let me give you a hypothetical. No, actually, it's a real story, but we'll not talk about the organization in question. But so I run a manufacturing organization, and Bob is a skilled machine operator. He's 20 years of experience. Problem is, Bob's not showing up to work every day now. Bob's coming to work every third day. And so now, how do I ensure the continued sort of relevance and integrity of my business model? This particular organization, as well as many others, has turned to automation to actually reduce its reliance on that highly skilled labor. So in this instance, the organization acquired a robot called Baxter. Baxter is a robot that does probably 12 to 14 different things. It costs about $25,000. It operates in a manufacturing environment, and it can take on lots and lots of different things, including things like precision milling that my colleague Bob would be doing. And today, instead of having that highly skilled machine operator, I've got a $25,000 robot. And the work of the humans now that are being hired are to train Baxter, to maintain it, to calibrate it, to help it adjust to its environment. And so in this instance, an example of where that skill premium has actually come down as a result of the application of automation. Making some sense? Probably the best example of the alternative or the reverse scenario is the significant premiums we're now paying for data scientists as a result of the sophistication of the different algorithms and technologies we have, as a result of the significant amount of data we now have, as a result of the significant increases in computing power. So we've seen the skill premiums associated with data scientists increase exponentially as a result of technology improving a fair bit. The other change that we noticed from the different participants, the 900 companies who participated in this study, was the changing mix of talent. And you can see that in the third bar over, where organizations expected to see continued reduction in full-time employees, but significant increases in talent coming from alternative sources. We asked the question as well in this study of the HR leaders who participated from these 900 companies, what are some of the changes they were making to accommodate a world of where humans and machines are combined? There were lots of things they were doing, but two things jumped out at us that were particularly troubling. The first is, and this was the reason we wrote the book, automation doesn't affect jobs. Despite everything you might read in the media, automation doesn't affect jobs. It affects component tasks. And the problem is, until you actually deconstruct a job and get to the task level, it's virtually impossible to see how automation will either substitute, augment, or create new work for humans. And so that second to last bar was very troubling because organizations were applying automation significantly, but had not actually gotten to the task level, which often resulted in significant missteps as they applied automation. What would often happen is automation would lead, talent jobs would be eliminated, but the work would not always go away. The work would not always be substituted by that automation. And so there are countless examples of how organizations have sort of let the tail of the technology wag the dog of the organization. The other thing that was particularly interesting, and there is a lot of debate about this, is what are the implications for the reskilling of the global workforce? The thing that we are seeing happen is the half-life of skills of various professions are shrinking dramatically as automation comes into play. But many organizations haven't figured out how do we reskill the talent we have to ensure that they are continually relevant as our business model and our work and technology evolve. The enablers of work automation that we looked at, I'm going to go through this slide pretty quickly because I suspect many in this room are familiar with the three dominant types of automation here, but robotic process automation was probably the most mature of the three different types of automation. RPA is being used extensively in virtually every white-collar environment. Much of the excitement is around cognitive automation, or AI. And then the third dimension is what we think of as social robotics. So in the old days with manufacturing, equipment was monolithic, it was homogeneous, it was often fixed in one location, didn't interact with humans, versus today we have robots like Baxter, where you've essentially got the combination of sensors to enable the equipment to process its environment, whether optical or otherwise, AI so the equipment can actually make sense of the data that's coming in and translate it into information, and then equipment that's often mobile in its sort of construct. And this is absolutely transformative in manufacturing and distribution environments. And so those three types of equipment, of automation, are critical in the transformation of work. And this is the framework that we put together to help business leaders actually understand what the future of work will look like as a result of the combination of automation. And it really starts off with understanding the work. Understanding three things associated with the work. What work is highly repetitive versus variable? What work is performed independently versus interactively? And then what's physical versus mental in nature? The logic of that will become apparent in a second. The second step, though, is one that often doesn't get asked. In many of our organizations, we assume and believe in a relationship between the performance of talent or the performance of work and the value to the organization, a straight upward sloping 45-degree line. So every unit of performance I get from my talent is viewed as actually driving the equivalent level of value to the organization. That is actually quite untrue. In our first book that John and I wrote, Transformative HR, we looked extensively at how performance and value were related, and we found across literally hundreds of organizations 4 different types of relationships. The first is what you see on the left side of this, and I apologize, I know it's probably a bit of an eye chart here. But what you have is a significant negative sloping curve where there is significant downside to an error. Think of the work of a pilot or a driller on an oil rig. What you want is every single pilot and every single driller operating at that minimum standard. You can't afford for one person to fall off that minimum standard because the consequences to both the organization and society can be devastating for the obvious reasons. And so what you actually have there is a play where you want to minimize the errors and you want to minimize the impact of an error. The second segment of the curve is where you want to minimize variance. Lots and lots of transaction processing work. You need everyone operating at a certain minimum standard. No real return to investing more or hiring someone who is the world's best transaction processor or doing it faster. What you want is sort of consistency and minimizing variance. The third is where you do see that relationship of that upward sloping curve. And then the fourth is where you see an exponential relationship. If you're in pharmaceuticals, think of the premium associated with having the world's best R&D scientists work for you. Think of the premiums associated in relationships where customer intimacy is critical and having the best customer relationship person working in front of your customers. And so you see an exponential relationship. But this is critical because it tells you what you're trying to solve for with automation. And then you combine those three different types of automation, and you end up with one of three outcomes. The first is where automation substitutes the work of a human. The second is where it augments that human being and actually creates superhuman capability. And the third, which unfortunately doesn't get talked about in popular media, is where the presence of automation actually creates significantly greater amounts of work for humans. And that's really what we tried to do with this book, was illustrate through about 130 different examples of how these different steps come together to illustrate the transformation of work. And so what do you get when you combine an academic and a consultant? You get like a really big matrix. And so in the back of the book, what you have is a matrix that illustrates all of the possible combinations associated with those continuums of the left, the return on improved performance curves, the three types of automation, and all of the potential outcomes, whether it's substituted, augmented, or transformed as a result. One example I'd really like to share with you, and this was the subject of a Harvard Business Review article that we had published just actually 2 weeks ago. This was a large oil and gas company that applied this framework to reinvent the work on their rigs. The technology for a completely autonomous rig exists today, but this organization, very thoughtful and progressive CEO, in his mind was, if we, as one of the largest players in this industry, actually execute and develop a completely autonomous rig, all we will do is speed a path to the bottom of reducing the cost of drilling a hole in the ground. How do we instead make the most of those assets we have, which is the ingenuity, the creativity, the innovation of our people on the rigs? And so instead what they actually did was to go through that framework and identify what work can we automate or substitute. For them, it was often the dirty, dull, and dangerous. So the highly repetitive things that end up costing people their fingers and toes, etc. What can we augment? So how do we augment the skills of the driller by making him much more productive in that environment? And then what new work can we create? The specific example that they had was today, of their 500 rigs, each rig was maintained and monitored by a driller on the rig. And the variance between the highest performing rig and the lowest performing rig was 40%. What they instead did was to use AI and sensors to take away the work of monitoring the rig from the individual driller and centralize it in a centralized control center. And in the words of the CHRO, I traded off a piece of work done by 500 brawny men and actually centralized it and gave it to a bunch of smart female engineers. And as a result of the use of those sensors and AI being handled by a group of engineers in Houston, the variance in performance of the rigs went from 40% to 3.5%. And so it's a great example of the power of automation to transform work. We had not planned for the diversity and inclusion benefit that came from it, but that was accretive. But it also pointed out to to us that when you reinvent the work, when you deconstruct it and ask the question of how do we best combine humans and machines, you get some answers that are pretty darn remarkable. And the outcome of this was they ended up raising their scale premiums by between 7 and 15%. Wages went up by 7 and 15%. And they were able to pay for that because the productivity of the average rig went up by 45%. So it's a pretty neat story, and again, it's on the HBR. I want to sort of end with a couple of things. The first part of the book is this framework for helping business leaders reinvent work and get to the optimal combinations of humans and machines by sustainably and responsibly automating work. The second part of the book is what does this actually mean for the organization and leadership? And the thing that is really jumped out at us as we wrote this book was, this isn't just about lifting and shifting a process like we did with outsourcing. This isn't just about slapping in new technology. What ends up actually happening is a fundamental change in not just the operating model, but the culture and the leadership requirements of the organization. And so there were 6 changes that we observed as a result of getting to that optimal combination. The one I want to call out for you, which I think is probably one of the most significant challenges, particularly for us in the Western democracies, because of its significant cultural implication, is that second one. This shift in mindset from I learn, I do, I retire, which came about in the Second Industrial Revolution, to a mindset of continuous learning, where it's I learn, I do, and maybe I take a rest halfway in between. But by most estimates, our children are going to have probably a 60-year working life. Their ability to continuously reinvent themselves and continuously retool themselves is going to be critical to their continued relevance. Professions that we've had for hundreds of years, pick on accounting. Accounting's been with us for 500 years. By most estimates, we will see more change in the next 5 years as a result of RPA and AI than we've seen in the previous 500 to that profession. And so our ability to continuously retool ourselves and reinvent ourselves and to have organizations that can actually create the headspace and bandwidth to do that is going to be essential. We then asked ourselves, what would we identify as being the most pivotal skills for 3 critical stakeholders in this equation of the future of work? For business leaders, I think probably the most critical ask is how do you orchestrate this ecosystem of potentially 8 different options for work, as opposed to thinking about hiring talent into roles and perhaps signing a merger agreement, et cetera. How do you orchestrate an ecosystem where the power dynamics look completely different from anything that we've ever seen? From a manager perspective, how do you coordinate all of these? How do you have a manager manage a team of people, use a number of individuals off of Upwork, use an RPA vendor, use an AI vendor, and figure out how to best coordinate the output from all of those different sources? That's not a skill any one of our managers is developed in. And then I think for HR, it's how do you curate this optimal combination of experiences for all of the people who touch your organization, for all of that talent who in some way, shape, or form is impacting your customers or your employees. How do you actually orchestrate an experience where they actually have a connection to your mission and purpose, regardless of the nature of their specific relationship with your organization? And the last thing I will leave with you is this. I suspect many of you, like me, was thrown when iPhone 7 came out and like, what the hell? I can't charge the phone and make a call on my headset at the same time. But if you think about it, it's actually a perfect metaphor for the change that's asked of us, right? If any of you had the great privilege of having a Motorola flip phone in 1996, I did. I hung on to that till 2007 when that iPhone came out, right? That was our frame of reference because I didn't need to change. Today, we expect perpetual obsolescence. Every day there's an app being upgraded. Every so often the operating system upgrades. I think it did that this morning. And every so often, if you're my kids, it's every year. If you're me, it's every 5th year. Your hardware upgrades. But we have grown to expect and demand this notion of perpetual obsolescence. That is increasingly what's going to be asked of us from a work perspective. This idea that I can acquire a set of skills and set it and forget it has become truly passé. And having organizations that are purpose-built for the continual reinvention of work is going to be critical. So I think I might have overstayed my welcome here, but I'd be happy to take questions during the break. Thank you all.